Royal Guard finds an injured German shepherd collapsed on the ground. His next move will break your heart. What you're about to witness will leave you speechless. A Royal Guard's next move, after finding a collapsed German shepherd, will break your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Watch until the end for an incredible twist that nobody saw coming. Don't forget to like, share, and comment below which country you're watching from. Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds loomed over Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and a bitter wind whipped through the streets of London. Tourists huddled together, their cameras ready to capture the iconic sight of the Royal Guard standing at his post, motionless, disciplined, the very image of unwavering duty. This particular guard had been standing there for hours, his red uniform pristine despite the threatening weather. His eyes remained fixed ahead, as they had been trained to do. Not a muscle twitched, not a finger moved. This was what it meant to be a Royal Guard, the embodiment of dedication and protocol. But then, cutting through the murmur of tourists and the distant rumble of thunder, came a sound that made his heart skip a beat. A whimper, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet somehow it pierced straight through his trained composure. It came again, weaker this time, from somewhere near his feet. The guard's training screamed at him to maintain his position. Never move, never react, never break protocol. These rules had been drilled into him countless times. Yet there was something about that sound that stirred a memory deep within him, something that made his fingers tighten ever so slightly on his rifle. A group of tourists walked past, their attention focused on their phones and cameras. A young woman in a red coat stepped around something on the ground, barely glancing down. A businessman hurried past, his shoes clicking on the pavement as he sidestepped the same spot. Nobody stopped, nobody looked, nobody cared. The whimper came again, and this time, the guard allowed his eyes to shift slightly downward. There, collapsed on the cold ground, just a few feet from his post, lay a German shepherd. The dog's fur was matted and dirty, its powerful frame now thin and trembling. Each breath seemed to be a struggle, its chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular movements. A child in the crowd pointed. "Mommy, look at the dog!" But her mother pulled her away, muttering something about strays and keeping her distance. More tourists walked past, some taking pictures of the unusual scene. A Royal Guard and a dying dog just feet apart. Some even laughed, wondering if the dog was part of some sort of show. The guard felt his throat tighten. Years of training warred with something else, something that felt like recognition. The way the dog's ears were shaped, the pattern of its coat, even the slight gray around its muzzle. It all seemed hauntingly familiar. But that was impossible. It couldn't be. A teenage boy approached, phone held high, recording everything. "Hey, look, guys," he called out to his friends. "Let's see if we can make the guard move. Maybe the dog will help." His friends laughed, gathering around. Their phones all pointed at the scene. The dog tried to lift its head at the commotion, but the movement seemed to cause it pain. It let out another whimper, this one weaker than before, and its head fell back to the ground. Its eyes, though clouded with pain, briefly met the guard's, and in that moment, something inside him shattered. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The tourists scattered, seeking shelter, leaving the dog exposed to the elements. Its fur began to darken with rain, and its shivering intensified. Still, protocol demanded the guard remain still, maintain position, never move, never break formation. But as the rain fell harder and the dog's breathing grew more labored, the guard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Real, genuine fear. Fear that if he didn't move, if he didn't break protocol, he would lose something precious, something he thought he had already lost long ago. The dog's eyes began to close, its breathing becoming even more shallow. Around them, the crowd had thinned, most people seeking shelter from the rain. Those who remained watched with phones raised, recording what they thought would be just another failed attempt to make a Royal Guard move. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would change everything. Time seemed to slow down as the guard's mind raced through his options. Each second felt like an eternity as he stood there, rigid and still, while the rain continued to pour. His uniform was getting soaked, drops of water running down his face like tears, but he didn't feel the cold. All he could focus on was the labored breathing of the German shepherd at his feet. The crowd that remained had grown quiet, perhaps sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. The only sounds were the pounding rain and the dog's increasingly weak whimpers. A young woman had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with concern. An elderly man shook his head sadly, muttering about how someone should do something. The guard's training echoed in his mind, memories of his instructor's stern voice. A royal guard never moves, never breaks position, never shows emotion. You are not just a soldier, you are a symbol of the crown's unwavering discipline. He had taken those words to heart, had lived by them every day for years. His perfect record was legendary among his fellow guards. But there was another memory too, one that kept pushing its way to the surface. A memory of warm brown eyes, just like the ones that had looked up at him moments ago. A memory of running through training courses, the sound of excited barking, the feeling of complete trust and partnership. A memory of a name tag that read, Max. The dog tried to move again, attempting to crawl closer to the guard's boots. The movement was pitiful, barely a shuffle, and ended in a pain-filled whine that cut through the guard's heart like a knife. The animal's eyes were beginning to glaze over, its breathing becoming more erratic. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed by a crash of thunder that made several tourists jump. In that brief, brilliant moment, the guard caught sight of something that made his heart stop, a glint of metal around the dog's neck. Not just any collar, but one he recognized, one that shouldn't be possible. His fingers began to tremble on his rifle. 10 years of perfect service. 10 years of never moving, never breaking character, never giving tourists the satisfaction of a reaction. 10 years of being the perfect royal guard. All of it hanging in the balance of this one moment. The dog's eyes began to close, and suddenly, none of it mattered anymore. The gasps from the crowd were audible as the guard's right foot moved. It was a small movement, barely a step, but it might as well have been an earthquake for what it represented. Phones were raised higher, cameras flashing despite the rain, as the guard did the unthinkable. He moved. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Is he actually—" The guard took another step, his movements precise and deliberate. The rifle, which had been held perfectly in position for hours, was now lowered to his side. Each motion was a conscious breach of protocol, each step away from his post, a violation of everything he had sworn to uphold. Then, in a movement that would soon become viral across the internet, the guard knelt down beside the dying German shepherd. His white gloves, pristine despite the rain, reached out to touch the dog's wet fur. The animal's eyes flickered open at his touch, and there was a moment of recognition that seemed to pass between them. More people were gathering now, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of a royal guard breaking formation. The crowd had grown to dozens, then hundreds, all watching in stunned silence as history unfolded before them. The guard's fingers found their way to the metal collar, pushing aside wet fur to reveal the engraving beneath. His hands froze as he read the faded letters, and even through his strictly maintained composure, those closest to him could see his shoulders tense. A child's voice broke through the silence. "Mummy, why is the soldier touching the dog? I thought they weren't supposed to move." The mother's response was hushed, almost reverent. "Sometimes, sweetheart, there are things more important than rules." The dog's tail moved slightly, a weak thump against the wet pavement, as if agreeing with her words. Its eyes remained fixed on the guard's face, filled with a trust that seemed to transcend their years apart. But just as the guard began to lift the weakened animal into his arms, a sharp voice cut through the rain. "Guard! What is the meaning of this?" The crowd turned as one to see a commanding officer approaching, his face thunderous with anger. The moment of magic was broken, replaced by a tension that crackled like the lightning overhead. The guard's career, his future, everything he had worked for, it all hung in the balance of what would happen next. And yet, as he cradled the injured German shepherd closer to his chest, his expression remained resolute. Because sometimes, doing the right thing means being willing to lose everything. The commanding officer's footsteps echoed across the wet pavement as he approached, each step deliberate and threatening. The crowd instinctively backed away, creating a circle around the scene. Rain continued to pour, but nobody moved to leave. They all sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. "I said, what is the meaning of this?" the commander repeated, his voice sharp enough to cut through steel. He stopped a few feet away from the guard, his eyes moving from the guard's face to the German shepherd in his arms, then back again. "Have you lost your mind? Do you know how many protocols you've just violated?" The guard remained kneeling, still cradling the injured dog. His uniform was completely soaked now, water dripping from his ceremonial bearskin cap. But his hold on the animal never wavered. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Sir, I apologize for breaking protocol, but this dog, I know this dog." The commander's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know this dog? What nonsense are you talking about?" With careful movements, the guard shifted the German shepherd slightly, revealing the military collar. "Sir, please look at the tag. This is Max, military working dog 2-4-7. He was my partner at the training academy 10 years ago." A murmur ran through the crowd. Phones were recording every word, every movement. The commander stepped closer, his expression skeptical, but as he leaned in to examine the collar, something changed in his face. The stern lines around his mouth softened slightly, and his eyes widened in recognition. "Max?" he whispered, almost to himself. "The Max who saved your life during the training accident?" The guard nodded, and for the first time, emotion cracked through his professional facade. "Yes, sir. The same Max who pulled me out of the ravine when the rope bridge collapsed. The same Max who disappeared 3 months later without a trace." Max's ears twitched at the sound of his name, and he tried to lift his head. The movement seemed to cause him pain, and he whimpered softly. The guard automatically tightened his hold, providing more support. "We searched for weeks," the guard continued, his voice thick with memory. "We never found a trace of him. The investigation suggested he might have been stolen, but there was never any proof. I always wondered, always hoped." The commander's face had transformed completely now, the anger replaced by something closer to understanding. He too had been there during those weeks of searching, had seen how the disappearance had affected the young soldier who would later become one of his best royal guards. "Sir," the guard said, looking directly at his commander for the first time, "I know I've broken protocol. I know there will be consequences. But Max is dying. He needs immediate medical attention. Whatever punishment is coming, I accept it. But please, let me help him first." The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the commander's response. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and in the relative quiet, Max's labored breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Then something unexpected happened. The commander reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the Royal Veterinary Service. They're the closest, and they're the best." He paused, then added more softly, "Max was one of ours. He deserves nothing less." The relief that washed over the guard's face was visible even through his practiced composure. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. But just as hope began to rise, Max's body suddenly went limp in the guard's arms. His breathing, already shallow, became almost imperceptible. The guard's training couldn't hide his panic as he quickly laid Max on the ground, checking for signs of life. "No, no, no," he whispered, his hands moving over the dog's chest. "Stay with me, Max. Please stay with me. I just found you again. You can't leave now." The commander was already shouting into his phone, demanding immediate assistance. The crowd pressed closer, many with tears in their eyes, all hoping for a miracle. Parents held their children tighter, couples gripped each other's hands, and even the most cynical observers found themselves holding their breath. And in that moment, as the guard fought to keep his old partner alive, no one cared about broken protocols or violated regulations. They were witnessing something far more powerful. A reunion 10 years in the making, hanging by a thread between life and death. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air, but would help arrive in time. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. The Royal Veterinary Vehicle screeched to a halt nearby, and a team of medical professionals rushed forward with their equipment. The crowd was pushed back, creating a space for them to work, but nobody left. They all stayed, watching, hoping, many of them praying for the dog who had somehow brought humanity to the unchanging face of a royal guard. "Severe dehydration," one of the vets announced, checking Max's gums. "Malnutrition too. How long has he been like this?" "We don't know," the commander answered, as the guard was too focused on Max to speak. "He just collapsed here, but—" He hesitated, then continued. "This dog disappeared from military service 10 years ago." The vet's hands paused for just a moment in surprise, then resumed their work with even greater urgency. 10 years? That's impossible. No dog could survive on their own for that long, especially not a trained military dog. Someone must have taken him, the guard said, his voice rough with emotion. Someone must have had him all this time. His hands hadn't left Max's fur, providing what comfort he could while the medical team worked. As they attached IV fluids and monitored Max's vital signs, something caught the vet's attention. She gently moved aside some matted fur on Max's shoulder, revealing a fresh scar. "This is recent," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "And there are others, older ones. This dog has been abused systematically for a long time." The guard's face hardened, and even the commander's expression darkened at this news. The crowd, who could hear everything, let out sounds of distress and anger. A young boy started crying, and his mother pulled him close, whispering comforting words. "But look at this," the vet continued, pointing to something else. "These marks around his legs, these are from chains, but they're worn down. I think he broke free. He escaped whoever was holding him." The guard looked down at Max's face, remembering the strong, proud dog he had once been. "He was always clever," he said softly. "Always determined. Even during training, he never gave up, no matter how difficult things got." The medical team worked quickly, setting up a portable warming blanket and administering emergency medications. Max's breathing was still shallow, but it had stabilized somewhat. His tail twitched slightly when the guard spoke, showing he was still aware of his old partner's presence. "Sir," another vet called out, "we found something else." She was examining the military collar carefully. "There's something stuck behind the name tag. It looks like paper." With careful movements, she extracted a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper that had been wedged behind Max's identification tag. It was damp from the rain, but still intact. The guard took it with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully. The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, phone still recording, as the guard's eyes scanned the paper. His face, trained to remain impassive, couldn't hide his shock at what he read. "What is it?" the commander asked sharply. "What does it say?" The guard's voice was barely above a whisper as he read. "If you're reading this, Max finally made it home. Check the tracking chip number 247B. You'll find everything you need to know. I'm sorry I couldn't save him sooner. K." The commander immediately pulled out his phone again, barking orders into it. The vet team exchanged glances, their hands never stopping their life-saving work on Max. "Tracking chip 247-B, one of them said. "That's not a standard military code. That's ... A private security firm," the commander finished, his face grim. "One that was shut down 10 years ago for illegal activities. They were suspected of stealing military dogs for private contracts, but we could never prove it." A small gasp went through the crowd as the implications sank in. Max hadn't just disappeared. He had been stolen, forced into who knew what kind of service, until he finally managed to escape. And somehow he had found his way back to the one person who would recognize him. The guard's hand moved to gently stroke Max's head. "You came back," he whispered. "After all this time, you came back to me." Max's eyes flickered open at the touch, meeting the guard's gaze. Despite his weakness, despite everything he had been through, there was still that same trust, that same loyalty in his eyes. His tail thumped weakly against the ground, but suddenly, Max's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and the medical monitors began beeping frantically. "He's crashing!" the vet shouted. "We need to move him now." The next few moments were chaos as the medical team rushed to stabilize Max for transport. The guard's world narrowed to the sight of his old partner fighting for his life, and a silent prayer that their reunion wouldn't end in tragedy. "We need to get him to the veterinary hospital immediately," the lead vet announced, her voice tight with urgency. "His condition is critical." The team worked seamlessly to transfer Max onto a stretcher, careful not to disturb the various tubes and monitors attached to him. The guard started to step back, his training telling him to return to his post, but the commander's hand landed firmly on his shoulder. "Go with them," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle things here. That dog needs you now more than the palace does." Gratitude flashed across the guard's face as he quickly climbed into the veterinary ambulance alongside Max. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away, sirens wailing. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, many wiping tears from their eyes, all of them knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. The commander watched the ambulance disappear around the corner, then pulled out his phone again. "This is Commander Phillips. I need everything we have on security firm case 247-B from 10 years ago. Yes, everything. And get me the investigators who worked the military dog theft cases. This just became an active investigation." Meanwhile, in the racing ambulance, the guard held Max's paw as the medical team continued their work. The German Shepherd's breathing was erratic, his body occasionally seized with tremors. Each time the monitors beeped in warning, the guard's heart seemed to stop. "Stay with me, old friend," he whispered, his thumb gently stroking Max's fur. "You didn't survive 10 years just to give up now. Remember the ravine? Remember how you never gave up on me then?" His mind drifted back to that day, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. The training exercise had gone horribly wrong. The rope bridge they were crossing had snapped, and he had fallen. Max, without hesitation, had grabbed the trailing rope in his teeth and held on, preventing him from plunging to certain death. Even when his own body was being pulled toward the edge, Max hadn't let go. He had held on until help arrived, his loyalty stronger than his fear. A sudden violent seizure from Max jerked the guard back to the present. The medical team rushed to stabilize him, their voices tense but professional as they worked. "Multiple organ systems are struggling," one vet explained as she administered another injection. "Years of malnutrition and abuse have taken their toll. But he's fighting. He's fighting harder than any dog I've ever seen." The guard wasn't surprised. Fighting was what Max did best. Fighting to complete missions, fighting to protect his partner, and now, fighting to stay alive. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the Royal Veterinary Hospital, and the back doors burst open. A new team of medical professionals waited to help, and Max was quickly whisked inside, the guard running alongside the stretcher. "Sir, you'll need to wait here," a nurse said gently but firmly as they reached a set of double doors. "We'll do everything we can for him, I promise." The guard stood helplessly as Max disappeared through the doors, the sound of urgent medical instructions fading down the corridor. His uniform was still soaked from the rain, his ceremonial bearskin cap long since removed, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was Max and the 10 years of suffering his partner had endured while he had stood guard at the palace, never knowing. His phone buzzed, a message from the commander. Investigation team assembled. The note mentioned K. Catherine Wells, former employee of the security firm. She tried to blow the whistle on their operation 10 years ago, but disappeared before she could testify. Just found her. She's alive, living under protection in Scotland. She's agreed to talk. This goes deeper than we thought. The guard read the message twice, his hands clenching into fists. All those years, all that time Max had been missing, it hadn't been a simple theft. It had been part of something bigger, something darker. A doctor emerged from the treatment area, her face serious. "Sir, we've stabilized him for now, but..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We found something during our examination, something embedded under his skin. It looks like some kind of experimental chip, different from standard military identification chips. We've never seen anything like it." The guard's blood ran cold. What had they done to his partner? What had Max been forced to endure during those lost years? Just then, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the commander. "You need to see this." Security footage from last week shows Max wasn't alone when he escaped. There were others, more dogs. But they didn't make it. Max was the only one who got away. He didn't just escape, he let a prison break. And now the people he escaped from know exactly where to find him. The guard looked up at the hospital corridors, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were. His partner had finally found his way back to him, but the fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Within minutes, the quiet hospital corridor transformed into a hub of activity. Police officers arrived to secure the building, their radios crackling with updates and coordinates. The commander himself showed up shortly after, accompanied by two serious-looking men in plain clothes who were introduced as Detective Inspector Roberts and Agent Thompson from MI5. The security firm wasn't just stealing military dogs, Agent Thompson explained in a low voice, showing photographs on his tablet. They were experimenting on them, using them as test subjects for some kind of enhanced training program. The chip we found in Max, it's connected to a larger operation, one that spans multiple countries. The guard felt sick to his stomach as he looked at the images. Secret facilities, medical equipment, rows of kennels. "How many dogs?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "We've identified at least 30 missing military dogs over the past decade," Detective Roberts replied. "But that's just from British forces. There could be more from other countries. Max is the first one we've recovered alive." A nurse emerged from Max's room, gesturing for them to keep their voices down. "He's stabilized, but he's very weak," she reported. "The next 24 hours will be critical. Whatever they did to him, his body has been through tremendous stress." The guard moved to the window of Max's room, looking in at his partner. The German Shepherd lay still on the medical bed, connected to various machines that beeped steadily. Despite his condition, Max's ears twitched at the sound of movement, his training still evident even in his weakened state. "Catherine Wells is being brought here under protection," the commander announced, checking his phone. "She says she has documents, proof of everything. She's been gathering evidence for years, waiting for a chance to expose them. When Max escaped, she knew it was time." But how did Max find his way back? The guard wondered aloud. After all these years, how did he know where to go? "Military dogs never forget their training or their partners," a new voice said. They turned to see a woman being escorted by more officers. She was thin, with graying hair and tired eyes, but there was steel in her gaze. Catherine Wells. "I worked at their facility as a veterinary assistant," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what they were really doing at first. By the time I figured it out, I was in too deep. They threatened my family if I talked, but I couldn't just watch them torture those dogs. I started keeping records, gathering evidence." She pulled out a USB drive from her pocket and handed it to Agent Thompson. "Everything's here, the experiments, the names, the money trail. But Max was special. He never broke, never gave in to their conditioning. He protected the other dogs, took punishments meant for them. And every night, in his kennel, he would look in the same direction. Always the same direction. Toward London, the guard realized. Toward home. Catherine nodded. When the chance came, he led the escape attempt. 8 dogs made it out with him, but the guards... She swallowed hard. Max held them off, gave the others a chance to run. But they were too weak, too damaged by the experiments. He was the only one strong enough to make it this far. A commotion at the end of the corridor interrupted them. More police were arriving, their expressions urgent. "Sir," one officer reported to Detective Roberts, "we've got movement. Multiple vehicles approaching the hospital from different directions. They don't look friendly." The lights in the corridor suddenly flickered, then went out completely. The emergency generators kicked in, casting everything in a dim reddish glow. From somewhere in the building, an alarm began to sound. "They're here," Catherine whispered, her face pale. "They'll want to eliminate the evidence, all of it, including Max." The guard looked back at his partner through the window. Max's eyes were open now, alert despite his weakness, sensing the danger. Their gazes met, and in that moment, a decade melted away. They were a team again, facing a threat together. The commander was already mobilizing, coordinating with hospital security and police. But the guard wasn't listening anymore. He was remembering another time, another threat, when Max had refused to leave him behind. Now it was his turn. He removed his ceremonial uniform jacket, the red fabric dark with rain and mud, and laid it carefully on a chair. Underneath, he wore the black t-shirt and tactical pants that were standard issue. 10 years of standing motionless hadn't dulled his combat training. If anything, it had honed his patience, his ability to wait for the perfect moment. "Sir," he said to the commander, his voice quiet but firm, "request permission to protect my partner." The commander looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Granted. What do you need?" The guard's response was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass somewhere below, followed by shouting and the first echoes of gunfire. They were out of time. The guard moved swiftly, years of military training taking over. "Get Max ready for transport," he ordered the medical team. "And Catherine, she's the key witness. They'll be coming for both of them." The emergency lights cast eerie shadows as chaos erupted throughout the hospital. The sound of boots on stairs echoed through the building, mixing with shouts and the crackle of police radios. Somewhere below, another window shattered. 4 men in the lobby, 2 coming up the east stairwell, 3 more on the west, an officer reported, listening to his earpiece. They're well armed and wearing tactical gear. The commander quickly organized their defenses, positioning officers at key points. Thompson, get Catherine to the secure vehicle. Roberts, coordinate with the tactical response team. They're 3 minutes out. But the guard knew 3 minutes might be too long. He could hear the intruders getting closer, their footsteps methodical and practiced. These weren't common criminals. They moved like military professionals. Inside his room, Max was trying to stand despite his weakness. The medical equipment beeped in protest as he pulled against the tubes and wires. The guard moved to his side, placing a gentle but firm hand on his partner's head. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "I know you want to fight, but let me protect you this time. You've done enough." Max's eyes met his, and for a moment, the guard saw a flash of the proud, strong dog he had been. Even now, barely able to stand, Max wanted to help. The German Shepherd's loyalty hadn't diminished one bit in 10 years. A nurse quickly disconnected the non-essential equipment, keeping only the critical IV line. "He's stable enough to move, but he needs to stay calm," she warned. "Any extreme stress could—" Her words were cut off by the sound of gunfire from the stairwell. The police officers returned fire, but the attackers were advancing with professional precision. "They're trying to pin us down," the commander observed grimly. "Split our defenses." The guard made his decision. "The service elevator," he said quickly. "It leads to the underground parking area. We can get Max out through there." "That's exactly where they'll expect us to go," Roberts argued. "Yes," the guard agreed, a plan forming in his mind. "Which is why we'll give them what they expect to see." Understanding dawned on the commander's face. A diversion. The next few minutes were a blur of coordinated action. A medical team made a show of rushing down the main corridor with a gurney, a dog-shaped form under the blankets. As predicted, several attackers immediately pursued them. Meanwhile, the guard lifted Max into his arms. The German Shepherd was heavy, but adrenaline and determination made the weight irrelevant. They moved quietly through the back corridors, using the confusion to their advantage. But they weren't alone. The guard's trained ears picked up subtle movements behind them. 2 sets of footsteps, trying to be silent. They'd been spotted. He quickened his pace, feeling Max tense in his arms. The dog's training was kicking in despite his condition. He sensed the danger too. They reached the service elevator, but the guard didn't press the call button. Instead, he moved past it, into a dark maintenance corridor. The footsteps behind them grew closer. "End of the line," a rough voice called out. "Put the dog down." The guard turned slowly. 2 men in black tactical gear stood blocking the corridor, their weapons raised. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but their stance spoke of military training. "You don't understand what that dog means to us," the second man said. "The research, the advancement, we're making them better, stronger." "Better?" The guard's voice was cold. "You tortured them, experimented on them, on my partner." "Your partner?" The first man laughed. "That dog belongs to us now, has for 10 years, and he's worth millions to the right buyers. The perfect soldier, unable to break, unable to die. The experiments made him stronger than you can imagine." Max growled softly in the guard's arms, the sound barely audible but filled with years of suppressed rage. "You're wrong," the guard said quietly. "You didn't make him stronger. He already was strong. Strong enough to resist you, strong enough to escape, strong enough to find his way home." The men raised their weapons. "Last chance. Put the dog down." The guard's lips curved in a slight smile. "You know what they say about royal guards?" he asked conversationally. "Everyone thinks we just stand still all day. They forget why we're chosen for this duty in the first place." The lights in the corridor went out completely. The commander's timing was perfect. In the pitch darkness, Max's growl grew louder. "We're chosen because we're the best," the guard's voice came from somewhere in the blackness. "And we never abandon our partners." What happened next would be talked about in whispers for years to come. In the pitch-black corridor, the attackers' night vision goggles gave them a false sense of security. They could see, yes, but they weren't prepared for what they saw. The guard moved like a shadow, his years of disciplined stance, training, translating into perfect balance even in darkness. Max, despite his weakness, seemed to understand exactly what his partner needed. The first attacker fired, but the guard was already moving. He rolled smoothly, protecting Max while simultaneously using his momentum to sweep the man's legs out from under him. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding into the darkness. The second attacker tried to adjust his aim, but years of standing perfectly still had given the guard an almost supernatural ability to control his movements. He flowed like water, every motion precise and economical. His elbow connected with the attacker's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. Max, though still weak, contributed in his own way. His military training hadn't faded. His growls were perfectly timed to distract and disorient. His presence an unseen threat in the darkness that forced the attackers to divide their attention. The fight was over in seconds. Both attackers lay unconscious, their weapons secured by the guard. The lights flickered back on to reveal the commander and several officers rushing down the corridor, weapons drawn. "Clear!" the guard called out, already checking Max for any signs that the brief conflict had worsened his condition. The German shepherd's breathing was labored but steady, his eyes alert and focused on his partner. "The others have been captured," the commander reported. "The tactical team caught them in the parking garage. Catherine is safe, and the evidence is secured." He looked at the unconscious attackers with raised eyebrows. "Though I think we just got some more evidence." "Sir?" An officer came running down the corridor. "You need to see this. We found something in their vehicle." They followed him to the parking garage, where police were examining a large black van. The back doors were open, revealing a sophisticated mobile command center. But what caught everyone's attention were the kennels, small, cruel-looking cages with various monitoring equipment attached. "They were planning to take more dogs," Catherine said, her voice shaking. She had returned with the tactical team, clutching a laptop. "I've accessed their communications. This was just the beginning. They have facilities all over Europe. Military dogs, police dogs, any working dog they could get their hands on." The guard felt Max tense in his arms, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he looked at the cages. How many cages like these had he seen in the past 10 years? How many other dogs had he watched disappear into them? "We'll find them," the commander promised, his voice hard. "Every facility, every dog, every person involved. This ends now." A medical team approached with a gurney, and this time the guard carefully laid Max down on it. The German shepherd tried to resist, still wanting to stay with his partner, but his strength was fading. "Rest now," the guard said softly, keeping his hand on Max's head. "I'm not going anywhere." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Police processed the scene and the captured attackers. Catherine worked with intelligence officers, sharing everything she knew about the organization. The commander coordinated with international agencies, setting in motion what would become one of the largest joint operations against animal trafficking and experimentation. But the guard remained by Max's side as he was properly settled into a secure recovery room. The medical team worked efficiently, replacing fluids, administering medications, and monitoring his vital signs. They were cautiously optimistic. Max's condition was stabilizing, his incredible will to live evident in every steady beat of his heart. As night fell over London, the hospital corridor was quiet except for the soft beeping of medical equipment and the occasional footsteps of security patrols. The guard sat in a chair next to Max's bed, still in his black tactical gear, his ceremonial uniform forgotten in the chaos. Max slept peacefully for the first time in what must have been years, his body finally beginning to heal. Sometimes his paws would twitch in his sleep, and the guard wondered if he was dreaming of running, of freedom, of finding his way home. "You know," the commander said, stopping by the room, "when all this is over, there's going to be questions about protocol, about breaking formation." The guard nodded, prepared to accept whatever consequences came. "Which is why," the commander continued with a slight smile, "I've already spoken to Her Majesty. She was quite moved by the story, and she has a rather interesting proposition for both you and Max." The guard looked up, surprised, as the commander handed him an official-looking document. As he read it, his eyes widened slightly, the only break in his composure. Max's tail thumped weakly against the bed, as if he somehow understood that their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. But a shadow passed across the guard's face as he read deeper into the document. Something wasn't quite right. And in Max's sleep, his peaceful expression suddenly changed, his paws twitching more urgently now. The night wasn't over yet. Max's whimpers grew more distressed, his body twitching more violently in his sleep. The medical monitors began showing irregular patterns, their steady beeping becoming erratic. The guard leaned forward, instantly alert to his partner's distress. "Something's wrong," he called out to the medical team. The nearest nurse rushed in, quickly checking Max's vital signs. Her expression shifted from concern to alarm as she read the numbers on the screen. "His body temperature is rising rapidly," she reported, already reaching for additional medication. "Heart rate extremely elevated. It's like his entire system is going into overdrive." The chief veterinarian burst into the room, having been summoned by the nurse's urgent call. She took one look at the readings and immediately began barking orders. "Get Catherine Wells in here now. This has to be related to those experiments." Catherine arrived moments later, still clutching her laptop. Her face went pale when she saw Max's condition. "Oh no," she whispered. "The fail-safe." "What fail-safe?" the guard demanded, his voice sharp with worry. Catherine's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard. "The chip they implanted, it wasn't just for tracking. It was designed to eliminate evidence if the dogs ever escaped. A final safeguard." Her voice broke. "They never meant for any of them to survive." The guard's hand tightened on Max's fur. After everything, the escape, the reunion, the fight, he couldn't lose his partner now. Not like this. "There has to be a way to stop it." Catherine nodded frantically, still typing. "There is. I developed a override code. I never had a chance to use it before, but..." She paused, her expression falling. "But I need direct access to the chip, and with Max in this condition, surgery would be too risky." The veterinarian was already preparing emergency medications. "Without surgery, he has minutes at most. The chip is triggering a cascade failure in his system." Max's eyes flew open, filled with pain, but still somehow focused on his partner. His tail thumped once against the bed, still fighting, still refusing to give up. The guard remembered all those years of standing motionless at his post, and how Max had never stopped trying to find his way back. "The chip," the guard said suddenly. "You said it was meant to be accessed remotely. That means it must have a receiver, a way to pick up signals." Catherine's eyes widened. "Yes, but we'd need specialized equipment." "Like the equipment in their van?" the guard interrupted. "The mobile command center they brought to capture Max?" "Clear the parking garage," the commander ordered immediately, already understanding the plan. "Get that van up here now." The story of the Royal Guard and his long-lost partner captured hearts around the world. Videos of their reunion went viral, and messages of support poured in from every corner of the globe. But the guard and Max remained focused only on each other, making up for 10 years of lost time. Then came the day of the official ceremony at Buckingham Palace. The guard stood at attention in his full ceremonial uniform. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him, wearing a specially made military collar with new insignia, sat Max. The German Shepherd's coat was glossy and healthy now, his posture proud as he watched the approaching royal party. Her Majesty herself presided over the ceremony. She spoke of loyalty, of the bonds between partners, and of the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Then she announced her decision: the creation of a new unit within the Royal Guard, dedicated to working with service dogs. Max would be its first honorary member, and his partner would lead the program. "Some rules," she said with a warm smile, "are meant to be broken for the right reasons, and some bonds are stronger than any protocol." The crowd cheered as Max was officially inducted into the Royal Guard. Tourists snapped photos of the unprecedented sight. A German shepherd sitting proudly next to a Royal Guard, both of them finally where they belonged. But the most powerful moment came later that evening, after the ceremony was over. The guard, now relieved of his duty to stand motionless, walked with Max through the palace grounds. They stopped at the exact spot where they had reunited in the rain those weeks ago. Max looked up at his partner, his brown eyes full of understanding. He had traveled so far, fought so hard, to return to this place, to this person. The guard knelt beside him, running his hand through Max's fur. "Welcome home, partner," he said softly. Max's tail wagged as he pressed against his partner's side. After 10 years of separation, countless miles of journey, and battles that tested them both, they were finally together again. Not just as guard and dog, but as two warriors who had never stopped believing in their bond. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the grounds, the guard and Max remained together, standing watch. But now they stood by choice, partners in service, their loyalty to each other as unshakable as the foundations of the palace itself. Their story became a legend, whispered among tourists and told to new guards in training. It was a reminder that true loyalty knows no boundaries, that love can survive any separation, and that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage come not from standing still, but from knowing when to move. And every day visitors to Buckingham Palace would see them, the guard who broke protocol to save his partner, and the dog who never stopped trying to find his way home. Their story wasn't just about a reunion, it was about the unbreakable bond between two souls who refused to give up on each other. Because some bonds truly never break, and some rules really are meant to be broken. For love.